Story 1. The ink-stained fingers of Byzantium, how scribes maintained the empire. In the hushed chambers of Constantinople's imperial chancery, the scratch of reed pens against parchment was constant. If you stood long enough in one of those dark, vaulted rooms, you might have thought yourself surrounded by 1,000 tiny insects. But this was the sound of an empire being maintained, not by swords or shields, but by scribes, ordinary men with extraordinary patience. You might not have heard of the scrinium, the bureaucratic heart of the Byzantine Empire. That's understandable. Scribes are rarely the heroes of history. Their lives were marked by repetition, silence, and ink-stained robes. And yet, it was these unnoticed men who ensured the continuity of the Byzantine state long after its generals had fallen and its emperors had changed. In this section, we'll explore the world of these scribes. What did they do, really? How were their documents organized? And how could such a mundane profession, copying decrees, transcribing correspondence, and maintaining records, serve as the foundation for one of the longest-lasting empires in history? The sacred bureaucracy. The Byzantine Empire didn't rely solely on military strength to hold its vast territory together. Its real power was its bureaucracy, and at the center of that bureaucracy were its scribes. From the 4th to the 15th centuries, armies rose and fell, but the scribes kept writing. The notarii, or official scribes, were civil servants. Some were assigned to high offices like the sacrum scrinium, a kind of imperial secretariat. Others worked under the logothetes, officials who oversaw the empire's various departments: finance, military provisioning, foreign correspondence. To the untrained eye, these scribes may have appeared unimportant. They did not command troops or issue edicts, but emperors relied on them to communicate orders across the empire. Every piece of parchment, every wax-sealed scroll that left the capital, bore their handiwork. They were also the keepers of memory. Every law passed, every tax collected, every marriage authorized by the church recorded, catalogued, preserved. Tools of the trade: pens, parchment, and protocols. The scribe's toolkit was simple but precise. They wrote with calami, pens made from reeds or bird feathers. Ink was made from oak galls and iron salts, dark and prone to fatting if not sealed properly. Parchment, animal skin, often sheep or goat, had to be meticulously prepared, scraped, and dried. Errors were not tolerated. A misspelled name could invalidate a land grant. A skipped line might undo a legal contract. Scribes worked slowly, double-checking every phrase. They were trained not only in writing but in imperial protocol: how to address the emperor, how to cite laws, how to phrase decrees with the proper flourish of authority. The most elite scribes worked on purple-dyed parchment, using gold and silver ink for the most sacred imperial documents. This was not art for its own sake. It was a performance of legitimacy. Each document had layers of meaning: literal, political, and ceremonial. And so, the act of writing became not just a task, but a function of governance. The archives and the art of filing. Behind every great empire is a well-organized filing system. The Byzantines developed archives known as chartophylicae, literally paper guardians. These were libraries of laws, decrees, land grants, and correspondence. Each document was tagged with dates, locations, signatures, and seals. Some were copied multiple times and stored in different locations in case of fire or rebellion. Redundancy was a virtue. Archivists were trained to locate a document decades old in a matter of hours. If a land dispute arose in the Peloponnese, the chartophylax could retrieve the original grant or tax record from a dusty cubicle in Constantinople. It's tempting to think of the medieval world as chaotic, disconnected. But Byzantium had a system arguably more consistent than many modern bureaucracies. A career of quiet significance. Being a scribe was not glorious. The pay was modest. The hours were long. Many suffered from eye strain, arthritis, and calloused fingers. But for many, it was a respected profession, especially in a society where literacy was power. Scribes often came from monastic communities or were trained by local clergy. Some entered imperial service through exams or apprenticeships. A few rose in rank, becoming advisors or clerks to important officials. Still, most remained anonymous. Their names are lost to time, hidden behind the titles and signatures they inscribed for others. But through their work, we glimpse them a silent presence behind the curtain of history. The hand that wrote the law. Think of how many battles were avoided because a letter arrived on time, or how many villages avoided ruin because a tax exemption was honored. These were the outcomes of words, not weapons. In an empire stretched across continents and cultures, language mattered. Scribes became masters of translation, Greek to Latin, Syriac to Armenian, ensuring messages crossed not just geography but linguistic borders. Even during times of collapse, iconoclasm, civil war, plague, the bureaucracy endured. The scribes kept writing. The final years of Byzantium, as the Ottomans closed in on Constantinople, were still marked by documentation. Decrees were issued, treaties drafted, requests sent to Western Europe, all by hand. As we rest our eyes on these dusty desks and ink-stained robes, it's hard not to wonder how many civilizations endured because someone simply wrote things down. And if Byzantium owed its longevity not to steel, but to the quiet persistence of scribes, then what might we owe to the bureaucrats and record keepers of today? When one imagines the Byzantine Empire, it's easy to picture gilded mosaics, elaborate court rituals, or military campaigns against invaders from all sides. But behind all of that glittering surface was a paper backbone, the Byzantine bureaucracy. In this section, we journey deeper into that invisible infrastructure, the files, protocols, and people who operated it. It was a system that governed not through charisma or conquest, but through scrolls, stamps, and signatures. This bureaucratic machinery was complex, often arcane, but surprisingly resilient. For over 1,000 years, it allowed emperors to project authority, enforce laws, and most importantly, remain remembered. Let's now uncover how scribes function not just as passive recorders, but as active agents in a system that managed war, religion, taxation, and diplomacy. The empire didn't run on gold, it ran on paperwork. The logothetes, masters of the departments. At the top of the Byzantine civil administration were the logothetes, or word placers. These officials, effectively ministers, controlled key departments, and every logothete had scribes beneath him. For example, Logothetes II Genikou, in charge of general finances and tax collection. Logothetes II Dramo oversaw imperial communications and foreign relations, including diplomacy and intelligence. Logothetes II Stratiotikou managed military provisioning and pay. Each department functioned with surprising efficiency, particularly considering the limitations of the time. Orders would be drafted by scribes in Constantinople and sent via a complex system of dromos, imperial post roads, reaching governors or strategoi hundreds of miles away. What's more striking is that even small, local decisions like whether a village needed repairs after a flood might require official correspondence back and forth between regions. Scribes not only wrote these documents, but also ensured they followed strict formatting, titles, and respectful language based on the recipient's rank. If something was miswritten, it might be dismissed or worse, cause offense. Bureaucracy in a time of crisis. The 7th to 9th centuries were especially difficult for the Byzantine state. Plague, invasions, and the controversial iconoclasm movement, which banned religious images, threatened to destabilize society. And yet, the bureaucracy continued. Even as armies failed to defend borders, civil servants, especially scribes, kept recording tax rolls, conducting censuses, and issuing property grants. They worked with priests, landowners, and local officials to verify ownership, update legal codes, and manage grain distribution during famines. During the 10th century, under emperors like Constantine VII, the imperial chancery expanded its role. Constantine, a scholar himself, authored a detailed guide for future rulers called De Administrando Imperio. It reflected an obsessive need to document how to govern, whom to trust, and what diplomatic language to use with specific ethnic groups. Every paragraph reveals a government concerned with protocol and memory. And yet, none of this would have existed without the scribes who copied his work, distributed it, and preserved it. The monastic scribes, parallel bureaucracies. While the imperial scribes handled secular matters, another parallel world of scribes worked within monasteries. These monastic scribes were not just religious copyists, they were record keepers, contract writers, and land managers. Many monasteries owned large tracts of land and needed to keep track of rents, harvests, and tithes. This meant detailed ledgers, contracts with local farmers, and correspondence with government officials. These scribes were educated in Church Slavonic, Greek, Latin, whatever languages were needed in the diverse empire. Their records were meticulous. Some monastic archives contain centuries-long chains of ownership, recorded in fading ink but preserved with surprising care. A vineyard near Thessaloniki might have its deeds traced back through dozens of scrolls, each one copied, sealed, and catalogued by hand. It's in these quiet corners of history, where a monk documented how many sheep were sheared in a given year, that we see bureaucracy not as a dry tool of power, but as a kind of memory keeping. Legal frameworks and bureaucratic language. One of the more impressive feats of Byzantine scribes was their use of legal language. Legal codes in the empire, especially under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, were expansive. The Corpus Juris Civilis, body of civil law, was compiled by scribes and jurists working together, combining centuries of Roman law into a single, formalized code. Even hundreds of years later, scribes referred to Justinian's laws when drafting contracts or resolving land disputes. But applying these laws was not simple. Every scribe had to understand not just literacy, but legal nuance. A well-phrased clause could save a village from additional taxation. A missing legal formula could invalidate a marriage. Bureaucratic literacy, knowing how to phrase, cite, and formalize, became its own kind of power. And this language was ritualistic. Many documents began with ceremonial invocations or concluded with formulaic blessings. These were not just flourishes. They were legal signals, letting a reader know the document was official, binding, and sanctified. How information moved, and sometimes didn't. Despite its organization, the Byzantine system had bottlenecks. Messages moved by courier, sometimes taking weeks to reach their destination. This delay forced scribes to anticipate problems, issue generic instructions, or write multiple versions of the same letter for different scenarios. To compensate, a hierarchy of communication emerged. Chrysibal's imperial decrees, often granting privileges. These were sealed with golden bully seals and carried immense authority. Prostegma, more common orders, issued by emperors or ministers. Sigillian, semi-official letters, used between departments or for local governance. The formatting of each line, spacing, seal placement, ink color signaled its importance. A scribe's mistake in presentation could diminish a document's power or cause confusion. For this reason, senior scribes often reviewed each document before dispatch. But sometimes, documents were deliberately delayed or altered. Corruption existed. Scribes were occasionally bribed to omit information or rephrase documents to favor one landowner over another. There are cases where entire property grants were forged. Yet, the presence of multiple copies and verification systems made such fraud risky. the human side of the machine. Behind every title and format there were people. We get glimpses of them in marginal notes, small scribbled comments, prayers, or complaints. In one 11th century document, a scribe in Cappadocia wrote, "Forgive me, Lord, for I am tired and my eyes fail me." Others left calendars, jokes, or even doodles in the margins. These moments remind us that while the work was repetitive, the people were not. They had ambitions, faith, anxieties. Some scribes kept diaries. One such diary from the 13th century describes an outbreak of plague and how the chancery was shut down for 3 weeks. During that time, the scribe continued copying religious texts in hope that God may deliver us. This was the same man who, a year later, documented an imperial treaty with Venice. As we look back, we must ask, how did such a vast bureaucratic system avoid collapse for over a millennium, especially in an age without printing presses, computers, or phones? Could it be that the very monotony of the system, its routines, its rigid formats, was what made it last? And if so, is there something reassuring in that? The fall of an empire is rarely a sudden affair. Even as walls crumble and rulers flee, the machinery of state often keeps turning for a while longer out of habit, out of necessity, or perhaps simply because someone hasn't yet told the scribes to stop writing. In this final section, we follow the last century of the Byzantine Empire, through its slow disintegration, through wars, betrayals, and the rising pressure from both Latin and Ottoman forces. And yet, remarkably, even as Constantinople was slowly being hemmed in, its scribes were still issuing documents, recording decrees, and sealing letters with wax and gold. We'll witness how this ancient administrative tradition came to its end, not with a sudden silence, but with the fatting echo of a pen scratching across parchment. Bureaucracy on a shrinking map. By the 14th century, Byzantium was a shadow of its former self. What had once been a sprawling empire stretching from Italy to Syria was now reduced to the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories in Greece. But inside the city's aging administrative buildings, the work continued. The chancery still functioned. Laws were still copied and proclaimed. The bureaucracy didn't disappear, it contracted. This period saw a strange phenomenon, a miniaturized empire with a disproportionately large bureaucracy. Emperors leaned on their scribes even more, as civil order depended less on military might and more on diplomacy, negotiation, and legal legitimacy. The scribes, in effect, became the lifeline between a collapsing past and a desperately maintained present. Their documents sought foreign aid, arranged marriages with Western dynasties, and negotiated trade privileges, especially with the Venetians and Genoese, who now held considerable influence. The chancery under siege. When the Ottomans laid siege to Constantinople in 1453, the city was already exhausted, but there was still administration to manage. According to eyewitness accounts, imperial scribes remained active in the final weeks, drafting emergency decrees, organizing food rations, and copying last-minute diplomatic appeals. One of the last surviving imperial documents, possibly dictated by Emperor Constantine XI, was a plea for aid to fellow Christian powers. Written in the formal imperial style, using the same bureaucratic phrases that had been used for centuries, it reads almost like a ritual. The empire was dying, but its scribes still followed protocol. It's worth pausing on this. Even in the final hours of Byzantium, people still believed in the power of written words. The empire may have had fewer soldiers than ever, but it still had seals, signatures, and scribes. The scribe who became a historian. Among the final generation of Byzantine scribes was George S. Francis, a court official who served under the last emperors and survived the fall of Constantinople. A bureaucrat by trade, he had written countless state documents in his career. But after the empire fell, he did something unusual. He wrote his own account of it. In Chronican Minus, S. Francis describes the last days of the empire from the perspective of an insider, not a general, but a functionary. He details failed negotiations, internal rivalries, the city's desperate lack of supplies, and the emperor's final preparations. Through his bureaucratic lens, we see a state still trying to operate as if it had time. His writing is factual, restrained, even as it recounts personal tragedies. His entire family was taken captive by the Ottomans. Still, he wrote, S. Francis represents a final bridge, from the impersonal scribes of empire to the personal voices of memory. His chronicle is one of the few surviving eyewitness accounts from within the Byzantine chancery. IV. What survived? Archives, systems, and influence. Although Constantinople fell, not all was lost. Much of the Byzantine tradition, especially its bureaucratic systems, lived on in other cultures. The Ottoman Empire inherited and adapted Byzantine record-keeping, merging it with Islamic administrative practices. Many early Ottoman scribes were Greek Christians trained under the old system. The Eastern Orthodox Church preserved many aspects of Byzantine clerical documentation, particularly in monastic settings like Mount Athos, which continued to produce and store scrolls in the Byzantine style. Renaissance Europe, especially Italy, admired and emulated Byzantine diplomacy and archives. The Venetians, in particular, adopted many document preservation practices and chancery rituals. In a way, the scribes of Byzantium trained their successors without ever knowing it. Their system of records, codices, formulas, and procedures provided a template not just for governance, but for continuity in chaos. V. The hidden monument of Byzantium. We often remember empires by their cathedrals or conquests, by their generals or gold. But Byzantium's true monument may be invisible. It's the continuity of thought, the consistency of governance, the rhythm of ink on parchment that never quite broke, not even in the darkest years. And although many of the documents have been lost, burned, buried, forgotten, a surprising number still exist. University libraries, church archives, and private collections house centuries-old scrolls, some still bearing the fingerprints of scribes who lived and worked behind the veil of power. Even today, when historians reconstruct the past of Byzantium, they do so not from ruins but from the work of scribes, tax rolls, court decisions, military rosters, and diplomatic letters. It was a civilization that, for 1,000 years, believed that writing things down could hold the world together. So when you next come across a dusty form, a bureaucratic delay, or a frustrating stack of official documents, perhaps pause and reflect. Are these not echoes of a time when empires were maintained by the quietest people of all, those who wrote, filed, copied, and preserved what others were too distracted to remember? Story 2. Post riders and relay stations. The Mongol yam system. Imagine standing on the vast, windswept steppe of Central Asia. There is no road beneath your feet, only flattened grass, scorched by the sun and crushed by hooves. In the distance, a lone rider appears on the horizon, moving faster than seems possible. He doesn't stop to rest or even slow down. Instead, he tosses a leather-wrapped message to another man waiting beside a fresh horse. Without a word, the second man mounts and takes off. The message continues its journey across mountains, rivers, deserts, heading to a Khan's court hundreds of miles away. This was the yam system, the Mongol Empire's remarkable relay network. Far from being a footnote in the story of Genghis Khan, the yam was one of the most effective logistical inventions in pre-modern history, a silent engine that allowed the largest land empire in human history to stay connected. It wasn't just about sending messages. It was about command, control, and coordination, without which the Mongols could not have governed the 9 million square miles they once held. In this first section, we explore how the system was built, how it worked, and why it was both admired and feared. The need for speed in a giant empire. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes in the early 13th century, he quickly found himself dealing with a massive problem: distance. An empire built on horseback is fast in conquest, but hard to manage once settled. Genghis Khan needed a way to issue orders and receive intelligence quickly across vast terrain, from the forests of Siberia to the rivers of Persia. And so the yam was born, named for the Turkic word for route or station. It was a relay courier system, a chain of riders and horses capable of carrying messages across the empire faster than any known system of the time. The yam was more than a collection of horses. It was a state-run communication infrastructure, designed with bureaucratic precision and military urgency. And for over a century, it functioned with startling reliability. Building the bones of the system. At its core, the yam was built on relay stations, called urtej or yam stations, placed about 25 to 30 miles, 40 to 50 km apart. These were strategically placed to allow a rider to reach one station in a single day's hard ride before handing off the message to the next courier. Each station was staffed and equipped. Fresh horses, often dozens per site. Food and shelter for riders, envoys, and sometimes travelers with passes. Supplies: saddles, tack, fodder, and writing materials. Guards or administrators to maintain order and record movements. It's estimated that under Genghis Khan and his successors, there were over 1,400 stations across the empire, stretching from Korea to Hungary. And it wasn't just for Mongol use. Official envoys from other nations, including Marco Polo, described using the yam system provided they carried a pesa, a stamped tablet of authority that granted access to its resources. The system's efficiency was astonishing for its time. Messages could travel over 200 miles per day, meaning a directive from the Khan in Karakoram could reach Samarkand or Kiev in just over a week. The writers, messengers of the Khan. Who were these messengers? Known as arrow messengers, arrow riders, they were elite horsemen, young, fast, and disciplined. Many were selected from among the Mongol military or from trusted local populations. Their mission was simple: do not delay. They traveled light, armed with a bow, sometimes a dagger, and always carrying sealed orders in oilcloth or leather. Stopping to sleep was rare. At relay stations, they changed horses and sometimes clothes but didn't linger. These couriers had a legal and cultural protection. Interfering with a yam rider was a crime punishable by death. The system depended on speed and trust, and even high-ranking generals were expected to stand aside for a passing courier. There were also multiple redundancy routes. During military campaigns, up to 5 different paths might be used to carry the same message. This avoided weather issues, bandits, and ensured that if one rider failed, another would succeed. But still, accidents happened. There are records of messages being lost in rivers, stolen by rebels, or even eaten by wolves along the remote trails of Siberia. Funding the network, burdens on the locals. As impressive as it was, the yam came at a cost, often to the subject peoples of the empire. Each station required upkeep. Horses needed to be fed, riders housed, supplies stored. The responsibility for this fell to the local populations, particularly peasant farmers and herders, who were assigned postal tax obligations. This meant supplying fodder, livestock, and manpower for the stations in their region. In some places, this was done voluntarily, but more often it was coerced. Failure to meet quotas could lead to punishment or fines. The yam became a source of tension, especially in newly conquered territories where resentment toward Mongol rule was high. Rebellions occasionally targeted yam stations as symbols of imperial authority. Yet even critics of Mongol conquest admitted the system's effectiveness. Persian chroniclers in the Ilkhanate marveled at how quickly the Khans could respond to distant events, and even the Chinese, no strangers to bureaucracy, acknowledged the yam's superiority in mobility and coverage. Standardization and the use of the peso. One of the key tools in maintaining control of the yam system was the peso, a kind of imperial passport, issued in wood, silver, or gold. This plaque bore the seal of the Great Khan and allowed the bearer to use the yam stations freely. Merchants, envoys, and officials who carried a peso could expect food, shelter, and fresh horses from any station they encountered. In a way, this served as a logistical privilege, binding the empire together. But with privilege came abuse. As the empire aged, the peso was handed out too freely. Unauthorized individuals began exploiting the yam, draining local resources. By the late 13th century, Kublai Khan issued reforms to rein in the system, revoking thousands of illegitimate peso. Still, the damage was done. Overuse of the yam in China and Persia began to strain the system. Where once the yam had symbolized control and order, it began to represent extraction and burden. So here we have a system of remarkable design and reach, stretching across deserts, rivers, and hostile terrain. And yet, like so many achievements in history, it faced the creeping threat of overuse, decay, and corruption. As we leave this first part of the story, a question lingers. How did the yam system evolve or crumble under the later Mongol Khanates, especially as the empire fractured, and the roads it built began to serve competing rulers? The yam system, arguably the most effective communication network of its time, was created to serve a singular, unified power, the Great Khan. But empires do not remain unified forever. After the death of Murg Khan in 1259, the Mongol Empire fractured into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the West. With the empire's division came fragmentation of its infrastructure, and yet, remarkably, the yam endured. In fact, each khanate adapted and expanded the system in its own way. But without the central authority of the Great Khan in Karakoram to enforce order and standardization, trouble began to seep in. In this section, we examine how the yam system evolved under each khanate, how it was used and abused, and how it slowly lost its coherence. This is the story of a once singular artery, slowly becoming a patchwork of regional roads still powerful, but increasingly vulnerable to decay. Yuan China, bureaucracy meets horsepower. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and founder of the Yuan dynasty, the yam reached its greatest scale and sophistication. Kublai moved the Mongol capital to Dadu, modern-day Beijing, and with that, the logistical center of the empire shifted eastward. Here, the yam was not just a military system, it became a governing mechanism. Yuan records show that. There were over 1,400 postal relay stations throughout China. More than 50,000 horses were kept ready at any given time. Boat stations were added along rivers to supplement land routes. The Yuan court codified rules about how much food could be requested by each rank of messenger, how far they could travel per day, and how long they could stay at each station. The system even recorded the names of station masters and the contents of messages, creating a paper trail for accountability. But the downside of this hyperformalization was bureaucratic overreach. Local populations in China were heavily burdened by postal taxes, and corruption became rampant. Officials began using yam stations as private convenience services. Bribes for faster service were common, and horses were diverted to local lords and merchants. Kublai tried to rein this in with a series of peso reforms, reducing the number of travel permits issued and introducing regular inspections of stations. But after his death in 1294, these controls weakened, and the yam began to deteriorate. Ilkhanate Persia, the yam in a fragile land. To the west, in Persia, the Ilkhanate under rulers like Hulagu and Ghazan developed a yam system well suited to the region's vast deserts and mountainous terrain. Relay stations were built from the Caucasus to Baghdad, and couriers were trained to carry news of rebellions, tax disputes, or trade opportunities. In the J. A. Macron M.I. letter to B.F. al-Tawarik, the historian Rashid al-Din describes the yam with admiration, noting how a message could reach from Tabriz to Khorasan in a matter of days. He writes that even the most remote governor could be summoned or dismissed within a week. Yet the Ilkhanate had a unique problem: internal instability. Persia's geography made it difficult to maintain consistent station spacing. Roads were vulnerable to raids, and tribal politics often interfered with postal routes. While Mongol rule brought a temporary unity, the underlying fractious nature of Persian territories always simmered beneath the surface. The yam in Persia depended heavily on foreign support, especially Italian merchants and Arab scribes, who helped manage logistics. In return, they were granted access to the system. But with each Ilkhan's death, loyalty fragmented, and with it, the roads became less secure. By the late 14th century, after the Ilkhanate collapsed, most of the yam stations were either abandoned or absorbed into local power networks. The Golden Horde long distances lose control. The Golden Horde, ruling over Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Eastern Europe, maintained a yam network that connected the steppes with the cities of the West. Their system focused on speed and simplicity: long-distance riders, broad spacing between stations, and minimal bureaucracy. The yam here was militarized. Couriers were armed and expected to serve dual roles: message delivery and intelligence gathering. They reported not only on military movements, but also on local resistance, weather conditions, and road quality. However, the system in the Golden Horde suffered from seasonal limitations. In winter, snow-covered paths became impassable. In spring, swollen rivers disrupted crossings. Stations often doubled as temporary forts, and horses had to be rotated based on migration patterns of local herders. Still, the Mongols managed to move orders from Sarai, their capital on the lower Volga, to distant Slavic territories in record time. But as the Rus principalities regained strength and the horde fragmented, the yam shrank. Moscow, in particular, began building its own system of local postal relays, eventually forming the basis of Russia's future communication infrastructure. Chagatai Khanate, a system struggling to survive. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate inherited much of the core yam infrastructure, but it also inherited one of the least stable political legacies. Without strong central leadership, the Chagatai rulers struggled to maintain consistent funding or staffing for the yam. Riders were often unpaid. Stations lacked supplies. Horses died without replacement. The nomadic traditions of the region were strong, but state organization was weak. Yet trade still flowed along the Silk Road, and merchants occasionally revived small stretches of the yam informally. Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Persian manuscripts still moved, though increasingly protected by private guards, not state riders. By the 1330s, the yam here existed more in name than function. It became a memory and echo of the grand routes once used by imperial messengers carrying the words of Genghis Khan. Decline through fragmentation. As a unified system, the yam could be trusted to deliver the Khan's orders across thousands of miles. But as the Khanates grew suspicious of one another, they began to restrict cross-border travel. A courier carrying a message from Persia to China in the 1260s might have completed his route uninterrupted. But by the 1330s, he might have needed separate passes for each Khanate or face confiscation, interrogation, or worse. This erosion of trust meant that merchants and messengers took longer, riskier, or unofficial routes. The yam, once the proud artery of the empire, became a network of semi-independent fragments, often duplicated, corrupted, or ignored. The dream of fast, centralized communication that had held the empire together began to fade. So what are we left with? An empire divided, a system copied but never fully replicated. The Yam continued to influence logistics across Asia and Eastern Europe, but it was no longer the miracle it once had been. And yet one wonders, could a communication network so vast, so embedded in daily governance, truly disappear overnight? Or did its bones continue to support other empires quietly, invisibly for centuries to come? Empires rise and fall, but infrastructure when built well has a strange way of surviving its creators. Stone roads outlast legions. Aqueducts continue to carry water long after the last emperor is gone. And in the case of the Mongol Empire, the Yam courier system did not vanish with the collapse of the Khanates. It quietly persisted, adapted, and inspired. In this final section, we trace the Yam's afterlife not in statues or chronicles, but in postal routes, bureaucratic habits, and ideas about communication. Across Russia, China, and Central Asia, remnants of the Yam would go on to influence the birth of modern postal systems and the very concept of imperial logistics. We'll also reflect on the surprising resilience of information systems. While military power fades quickly, the quiet routines of administration, of delivering a letter on time, of passing a message hand to hand, can ripple across centuries. Tsarist Russia, building on steppe foundations. When Moscow began to emerge as a powerful state in the 14th and 15th centuries, it absorbed many features from the Mongol system it had once paid tribute to. Among these was the concept of relay stations for fast communication across the expanding Russian territory. The Russian word yam was retained. In fact, the early Russian postal system was explicitly called the Yamskaya Sluzhba, the Yam service. Under Tsar Ivan Ivan the Terrible, in the 16th century, the Yamskaya Sluzhba was expanded and formalized. Stations were built 25-30 miles apart, following Mongol patterns. Couriers, called yamshchiki, were state employees bound to strict service. A post tax was levied on towns and villages to fund the system, just as the Mongols had done. Even into the 18th century, under Peter the Great, the Yam model continued to influence Russian communication, connecting St. Petersburg to Siberia with what was essentially a Mongol blueprint. Though the name Yam eventually faded, its structure was codified into Russian bureaucracy. Roads were charted, stations documented, and the act of relaying messages became a professional civil service. The Ming Dynasty reimagining the Yam. In China, the Yuan dynasty's collapse in 1368 was followed by the rise of the Ming Dynasty, a Han Chinese regime that sought to eliminate Mongol influence. And yet, when it came to communication, the Ming rulers recognized efficiency when they saw it. The Ming court revived and reshaped the Yuan Yam system, integrating it with existing Tang and Song dynasty postal precedents. Known as the Yizhen system, it retained several Mongol features. Station spacing and placement remained similar. Use of official travel passes, analogous to the Mongol peza. Institutional oversight and harsh penalties for disrupting messages. However, the Ming government also re-centralized control, limiting access to courier services strictly to imperial agents. Unlike the more open Mongol Yam, the Ming system was restrictive, designed to protect state secrecy and reduce foreign influence. Still, the philosophy of swift, redundant communication across provinces had taken root. In later centuries, even the Qing dynasty would build on this foundation. The roads the Mongols had mapped, literally carved into earth and memory, were still there. The hooves had changed, but the path remained. The Silk Road's shift to commerce. Even after political fragmentation, the Yam's physical roots remained useful not just for couriers, but for merchants. Caravans traveling the Silk Road during the late 14th and 15th centuries often followed the same paths established by yam couriers. This made sense. The relay stations were spaced for travel, often located near water and protected by forts or outposts. Even if the horses and riders were gone, the infrastructure remained. In time, former yam stations became waypoints for caravans, inns or trading posts, nodes in informal courier networks used by merchant guilds. While the political function faded, the yam helped shift the Silk Road from a route of empire to a route of commerce, connecting Central Asian bazaars to the ports of China, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Marco Polo in the 13th century had already noted the dual purpose of yam roads. By the 15th century, traders used them as commercial arteries, even as imperial use declined. IV. The invisible legacy systems thinking. Beyond roads and horses, the yam left behind something more abstract but equally influential, a way of thinking about empire as an information system. Genghis Khan and his successors understood something many modern states take for granted. Governance is not just about conquest, but communication. The yam taught that power must be projected constantly, not just asserted once. That reliability and redundancy were worth more than brute speed. That infrastructure must be supported by law, tax, and labor, not just ambition. These ideas migrated quietly into the administrative DNA of later empires. The Ottomans, the British, the Qing, the Russian czars. Even in the 19th century, when European powers built railroads and telegraph lines across colonies, the philosophy was the same. To hold territory, you must move messages. The yam today, a faded trail but not forgotten. Today, little physical trace remains of the yam. Some ruins of relay stations exist in Inner Mongolia and Central Asia, worn by wind and time. A few museums in Russia and China reference the system, often in footnotes. But its influence lives on in postal routes, military logistics, and even modern supply chain thinking. In Kazakhstan and Mongolia, folk memories of yam messengers remain in oral tradition stories of heroic riders, dangerous deliveries, and miraculous speeds. These are echoes, perhaps exaggerated, but rooted in the reality of a system that once worked so well it seemed like magic. Even the Mongolian government today, in naming infrastructure projects, occasionally invokes terms like yam as a cultural nod to this past. So what do we learn from the yam? That a communication system, built from horse sweat and routine, can become the most quietly powerful force in an empire. That trust in messengers, discipline in process, and careful use of local labor can bind vast territories together without needing the sword. And perhaps this is the quietest legacy of all. That sometimes, the people who merely pass along messages shape the world as much as those who send them. Story 3. The tally stick economy, when notches meant money. Money in the modern world is often seen as sleek, metallic, or digital coins stamped with authority, paper backed by trust, numbers glowing on a screen. But in medieval England, some of the most important financial instruments weren't minted in gold or inscribed in ink. They were carved into sticks. These were tally sticks, seemingly crude pieces of wood marked with notches, and for over 600 years, they formed the basis of England's domestic accounting system. Kings, sheriffs, merchants, and peasants all used them. They recorded taxes, debts, and repayments. They were accepted in courts and honored by the crown. This system wasn't a relic of a primitive age. It was deliberate, trusted, and legally binding. And yet, it's largely forgotten today, perhaps because it seems too simple to be important. But in this first section, we will explore how this strange and surprisingly efficient system worked, who used it, and why a notched piece of wood could carry the weight of a nation's finances. Because, after all, Money isn't about material, it's about memory. What is a tally stick? At its most basic, a tally stick is a slender piece of wood, often hazel or willow, cut to a specific length. On one side, it bears notches, each representing a unit of currency: pounds, shillings, or pence. But tally sticks weren't just passive records. They were split in two, creating a matched pair. One half was the stock kept by the creditor, often the exchequer or government. The other was the foil held by the debtor, usually a taxpayer or borrower. The stick was split lengthwise along the grain, ensuring the notches would match perfectly. This created an unforgeable record. Only a genuine pair could be reunited without visible tampering. It was a system of built-in verification. You couldn't erase ink or forge a signature, but you couldn't fake a notch pattern and make it fit either. Origins and royal endorsement. The use of tally sticks in England dates back to at least the 12th century. During the reign of Henry I at that time, the English treasury, known as the Exchequer, faced a problem familiar to many governments: how to track taxes and payments in a kingdom where few were literate and coinage was scarce. The tally stick was the answer. It allowed sheriffs to record tax payments without needing writing. The Exchequer would issue a tally, split it, and send one half with the sheriff to collect taxes. When the sheriff returned with money, the matching halves were reunited and validated. The system was trusted enough that it outlived generations of kings. Even as literacy grew, tally sticks remained the official method of record-keeping for the crown's revenues, used until the early 19th century. That's right, long after paper money existed, England still used wooden sticks to track taxes. The language of notches. The notches themselves were highly standardized. A deep, wide notch stood for 1,000 pounds. A slightly smaller notch meant 100 pounds. A thinner one indicated 20 pounds, then 10 pounds, and so on down to tiny slits for pence. This system wasn't arbitrary. It was visual and tactile. Even someone who couldn't read numbers could learn to distinguish the marks. Holding a tally stick was like reading a ledger written in texture instead of ink. And because the sticks were split vertically, the length of each half matched the original. Even the type of wood and the grain could be checked against counterfeits. The word stock, in fact, comes from this practice. The stock portion of the tally stick represented the lender's claim, and from that, we get modern financial terms like stockholder and stock market. Tally sticks as money. In time, tally sticks became more than records, they became instruments of exchange. The crown began accepting tally sticks as payment for taxes, fees, and debts. In a typical case, a merchant might lend money to the king for a war or public works project. The exchequer would issue a tally as a record of the debt. That tally could then be used to pay the merchant's taxes the following year or sold to someone else, who would then use it as a form of credit. Tally sticks began to circulate like money. They could be bought, sold, traded, especially if the holder trusted that the government would honor them. In this way, England developed a kind of wooden-backed financial market, where future tax obligations were monetized through tallies. Everyday use and the reach of the system. Though most official tallies came from the exchequer, the concept filtered into daily life. Shopkeepers used mini tally sticks for tabs. Farmers recorded livestock debts on sticks split with neighbors. Even churches tracked tithes this way. For those without access to parchment, ink, or literacy, the tally stick was a lifeline of accountability. Court cases sometimes hinged on tally evidence. If two halves fit, that was proof. If they didn't, someone was lying. Because of this, tallies had to be kept safe. They were stored in wooden chests, stone archives, or in the walls of manor houses, hidden away like legal documents. The Royal Exchequer itself maintained vast archives of tallies, sorted by year, county, and payer. Benefits in a cash-strapped world. Why did tally sticks thrive for so long? Coin shortages. Medieval England often lacked sufficient coinage, especially in rural areas. Tallies provided a way to record debt and payment without needing cash in hand. Low literacy rates. Not everyone could read or write, but almost anyone could match two halves of a stick. Incorruptibility. A match tally could not be forged or altered easily. Paper documents could be forged. Tallies were physically unique. Legal recognition. Courts and the crown recognized tallies as legitimate evidence. They weren't informal, they were binding instruments. Yet despite its usefulness, the tally stick system had limitations. Storage became cumbersome. Matching records took time. And as paper documentation and bureaucracy evolved, tallies began to feel outdated. Still, as we close this section, we must pause to reflect. Why did England, the birthplace of common law and constitutional government, continue using wooden notches to track national finances for over 6 centuries? What made this system so trusted, so enduring, that it outlasted feudalism, the Black Death, and even the printing press? When we left off, tally sticks had proven to be more than simple wooden records. They were durable, legible to the illiterate, resistant to forgery, and uniquely English in their financial functionality. But they weren't just rustic tools for peasants and sheriffs. In this section, we look at how tally sticks became central to royal finance, turning into debt instruments, tax receipts, and even early government bonds. It's a surprising tale of how a medieval government used wood to create an entire fiscal infrastructure, and how that infrastructure was eventually stretched to its limit. We'll also explore the risks, fraud, speculative trading, and the slow institutional creep that transformed a trusted system into something increasingly complex and at times corrupt. The crown's endless need for money. Monarchs are rarely satisfied with the contents of their treasury, and in medieval and early modern England, kings had wars to fight, castles to build, and favors to grant. But raising money through taxes took time, and calling Parliament to approve new levies was often politically sensitive. So kings turned to a solution: borrow against future taxes. The Exchequer began to issue tallies of anticipation, essentially IOUs backed by the crown's promise to repay lenders through future tax receipts. A merchant, banker, or noble would lend money to the state and receive a tally stick in return. That tally would entitle the bearer to collect a certain amount of tax revenue either from a specific district or out of the general tax pool on a future date. These weren't informal agreements. They were legally binding, backed by the Exchequer's records and, importantly, by centuries of administrative precedent. The rise of a wooden bond market. As these tallies of anticipation became more common, a secondary market emerged. Holders of tallies didn't always want to wait for repayment, so they began trading them sometimes at a discount. Let's say you had a tally entitling you to £100 in tax repayments next year. If you needed cash now, you could sell that tally to someone else for £90. They would wait the year and collect the full amount. In this way, tally sticks became transferable debt instruments. By the 14th century, this market became a quiet but significant part of England's financial system. Lenders, often wealthy merchants or members of the nobility, treated tallies much like modern treasury bonds. Tallies were even accepted as collateral in legal disputes and land sales. They weren't currency, but they functioned like money, especially in the rarefied world of royal finance. Tally fraud and falsification. With growing value came growing temptation. Fraud entered the system in several forms. Counterfeit tallies. Though hard to replicate exactly, some attempted crude imitations or even spliced sticks to fabricate matching pairs. Duplicate issues. Corrupt officials in the Exchequer sometimes issued multiple tallies for the same debt, inflating obligations on paper while pocketing funds. False notching. A carefully altered notch deepened or extended could increase the apparent amount owed. To combat this, the Exchequer developed tight verification protocols. Tallies were stored in iron-bound chests, overseen by appointed clerks. Matching a foil to its stock was a ceremonial process, often done in public to reduce tampering. But as with any long-standing system, cracks formed especially as the volume of tallies ballooned beyond the ability of administrators to efficiently manage and match them. IV. The tally stick and the national debt. By the late 17th century, England was entering a new financial era. Wars against France, colonial expansion, and domestic instability required massive expenditures. The crown could no longer rely on periodic loans from nobles or merchant syndicates. It needed a permanent system of credit, a way to manage public borrowing systematically. And so, in 1694, the Bank of England was founded. The tallies didn't disappear immediately, but their relevance diminished. The Exchequer continued to issue them for a while, but now they were only one of many tools in an increasingly sophisticated system of finance that included government bonds, bank notes, stock shares in national enterprises. Ironically, the tally system's very simplicity became its liability. It was no longer agile enough for the scale and speed required by modern warfare and global trade. Still, the tallies held on. Their symbolic authority, their association with centuries of government practice gave them inertia. Officials trusted them, and old habits die hard. The final tallies, a bureaucratic anachronism. By the early 19th century, tally sticks were still in use at the Exchequer, though now mostly as ceremonial relics. Clerks used them to record tax receipts from local collectors, often duplicating entries on paper ledgers. The Treasury finally ordered the abolition of the tally system in 1834, long after its practical use had ended. What followed, however, was one of the most dramatic and ironic conclusions to a historical institution in English history. As this section ends, we must ask, how could a tool of such bureaucratic caution, a device created to prevent fraud and preserve records, end in disaster, fire, and destruction? Can the death of a financial system carry with it the literal collapse of a building that housed it? After more than 600 years of faithful service, the humble tally stick, a notched piece of wood that tracked England's taxes, debts, and promises, was finally obsolete. The British government had moved on. New accounting systems, improved literacy, and the power of paper had rendered the tally redundant. But history has a strange sense of drama. In this final section, we recount the end of the tally system not with quiet archival burial, but with a fire that consumed centuries of tradition and a national landmark in the process. We'll reflect on the symbolism of that ending and the strange lesson that sometimes the attempt to discard bureaucracy can be more dangerous than bureaucracy itself. A quiet obsolescence. By the early 19th century, the Exchequer's use of tally sticks was seen as embarrassingly outdated. Reformers mocked them as relics of a feudal age. The sticks still technically served a function, recording payments from tax collectors to the Treasury, but their practical value was minimal. A parliamentary commission finally decreed their abolishment in 1826, though it took until 1834 for the last of them to be cleared out. What remained was not just a historical curiosity, but a logistical problem. What to do with thousands upon thousands of wooden sticks, some dating back centuries? They were records, yes, but also dry, seasoned kindling stacked in the ancient chambers of the Exchequer in the Palace of Westminster. Disposal, a bureaucratic afterthought. The task of disposing of the old tallies was assigned without much ceremony to the clerk of works. Rather than consider preservation or gradual burning, the office opted for something efficient: The sticks would be burned in the furnaces used to heat the House of Lords, a large chamber at the Palace of Westminster. But there was a problem. The chimneys were narrow and old, and the workers, likely untrained in such large-scale incineration, fed the sticks in too quickly, choking the flues with smoke and embers. On October 16, 1834, a fire began to smolder in the flues beneath the House of Lords. Within hours, it had engulfed much of the Palace of Westminster, including the House of Commons and the historic Exchequer chambers. Centuries of architectural history burned. Onlookers watched helplessly as the medieval heart of British government collapsed in flames. Among the ashes were the last physical remnants of the tally system. The destruction of the Palace of Westminster. The 1834 fire remains one of the most significant peacetime disasters in British history. Nearly two-thirds of the palace was destroyed, including irreplaceable documents, artworks, and medieval architecture. It was, ironically, a fire caused by obsolete bureaucracy, the physical remains of an ancient accounting system that had long outlived its usefulness. In the aftermath, an official inquiry blamed the fire squarely on the inappropriate disposal of tally sticks. The disaster wasn't the result of rebellion, war, or foreign invasion. It was caused by an administrative cleanup. This single act of bureaucratic tidying led to the loss of one of the most iconic historic buildings in the country. In time, it would be rebuilt, but in an entirely new style. The modern Gothic Revival Palace of Westminster, designed by Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin, now stands where the medieval halls once did. A symbolic ending. It's tempting to read the destruction of the palace by tally sticks as purely accidental, and it was, but it was also deeply symbolic. Tally sticks had, for centuries, represented the memory of the state, a physical embodiment of debts owed, taxes collected, and authority executed. They were a system of trust, of accountability, and yes, sometimes of oppression. Their end by fire was also the end of an era. Britain was transitioning into a new form of governance, more centralized, more bureaucratic, more modern. The Bank of England had replaced the Exchequer. Bonds and printed notes had replaced notches in wood. But the tally system's long life reminds us that primitive does not mean ineffective. For centuries, these sticks functioned as money, records, receipts, contracts, and legal instruments. They were trusted not because they were complex, but because they were simple, tangible, and honest. Lessons from the tally stick. So, what can we learn from this odd chapter of financial history? Technology doesn't need to be sophisticated to be effective. The tally system worked for 600 years not in spite of its simplicity, but because of it. Trust in systems comes from stability, not innovation. Tallies were consistent. They were physical. They resisted forgery in a world where literacy was rare. Obsolete systems can leave dangerous legacies. Even in death, the tally sticks made history by destroying it. Words like stock and foil carry histories within them. The financial language we use today owes debts to those wooden sticks and the clerks who split them. In the end, the tally stick economy wasn't just about wood. It was about recording memory in material form, about managing the debts of a kingdom one notch at a time. And though they may have gone up in smoke nearly 2 centuries ago, their legacy lingers in our accounting, our terminology, and our quiet, enduring faith in the power of records to shape nations. Story 4. Candle clocks and timekeeping monks, regulating life before the bell. Long before the chime of factory whistles or the tick of wristwatches, time moved more slowly, measured not by minutes and seconds, but by ritual, repetition, and rhythm. For most medieval people, time was seasonal, imprecise, and largely irrelevant to daily survival. But in one place, time was not only noticed, it was obeyed. That place was the monastery. Within the stone walls of abbeys and cloisters, Monks lived by a rigid structure of prayer, work, and rest, dividing the day into canonical hours, each carefully observed. But without mechanical clocks, how did they mark time? How did they ensure the bell tolled for matins before dawn or for vespers at dusk? The answer is surprisingly humble: candles, water clocks, sun shadows, and star positions. In this first section, we explore how time was kept in medieval monastic communities, not with gears and escapements, but with wax, patience, and devotion. We'll journey into the quiet halls of a Benedictine abbey, where a brother watched a flame inch toward a line scratched in wax's eyes, the only mechanism required to regulate the passing of sacred hours. Why monks needed time. To understand medieval monastic timekeeping, we must first understand monastic life. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and adopted across Western Europe, structured the monk's day into a fixed sequence of prayer and work. This rhythm, known as the divine office, was divided into 8 canonical hours. Matins during the night, often before dawn. Lauds dawn. Prime first hour of the day, around 6 a.m. Terce mid-morning. Sext noon. None mid-afternoon. Vespers evening. Compline before bed. These weren't optional. Missing the office was a spiritual failing. So time had to be tracked even in the darkest months, deepest winters, and quietest halls. Someone needed to know when it was time to rise and pray. Candle clocks wax as a watch. The most common monastic timekeeping device was the candle clock, a large candle marked with measured intervals. Each mark represented a fixed unit of time, often half an hour or an hour, depending on the candle's size and burn rate. A candle might be 12 inches tall, divided into 12 sections, and burn evenly at about 1 inch per hour. The monk assigned to keep time, often the sacristan, would observe the candle, nodding the descent of the flame toward the next mark. When the wax melted past a certain point, it was time to ring the bell. To assist with nighttime prayer, some candles were fitted with embedded nails or balls, which would drop noisily into metal pans when the wax reached them, an audible cue in the darkness. This was not high precision. Candle burn rates varied with temperature, drafts, wax purity, and wick trimming. Yet, over generations, monks grew skilled in adjusting and calibrating their candles. In a way, the candle became not just a light source, but an illuminated clock, a sacramental object whose slow consumption echoed the monk's own temporal journey. Water clocks, the drip of time. Another method was the clepsydra, or water clock. This ancient device had been used by Egyptians and Greeks, and was adopted in some medieval monasteries, especially in warmer climates where freezing was not an issue. A basic clepsydra consisted of a container filled with water, a small hole at the bottom or side, a marking vessel to catch and measure the flow. As the water dripped, monks could track its rise or fall against etched lines. The device might be used to time intervals between prayers or determine when to toll the bell. More elaborate versions had floaters attached to dials, turning slowly with the rising water to indicate hours visually. But clepsydras had drawbacks. Evaporation skewed timing. Clogging was common. They required constant refilling and close monitoring. In cold climates, the water clock was unreliable in winter. Yet in southern Europe, especially Italy and Spain, it provided an impressive level of time control long before mechanical clocks emerged. The sun and the shadow. In daylight hours, monks often relied on sundial stone or wooden instruments placed in cloisters or gardens. These used a gnomon, a projecting stick or triangle, to cast shadows on a dial marked with canonical hours. Sundials were usually custom-made for the monastery's latitude, and monks would adjust their schedules seasonally. But sundials, of course, only worked when the sun was shining. Cloudy days and long winters rendered them useless. Still, they remained symbols of order, carved into church walls, and sometimes painted in cloisters as visual guides to divine rhythm. At night, stars and moon phases were also used. Some monks developed basic astronomical charts, noting the position of certain constellations as time indicators. These methods were not exact, but they weren't intended to be. The goal was not to measure time with scientific precision, but to honor it with devotion. Human clocks, the sacristan's vigil. Ultimately, even with candles and clepsydras, the most reliable clock was a human being. The sacristan, or his assistant, was tasked with keeping vigil rising during the night to check the candle, tend to the water clock, and toll the bell when it was time for matins. This was considered a sacred responsibility. The rest of the community depended on the timekeeper's attention. Falling asleep on duty could lead to missed prayers or penance. In some larger monasteries, sacristans worked in shifts, rotating through the night. Others used knocking monks, brothers tasked with walking the dormitories before each service, gently tapping doors or shoulders to wake the brethren. This system was remarkably effective. Despite the lack of mechanical clocks, monastic communities maintained an astonishing consistency of routine, often more so than urban populations centuries later. The psychological rhythm of time. Monastic timekeeping shaped not just schedules, but perception. Life in the monastery was deeply tied to temporal structure. The hours were not abstract, they were named, prayerful, and sacred. Each segment of the day had meaning, tied to Christ's passion, the Virgin's life, or the Church's calendar. Time was not seen as linear progress, but as a repeating cycle of devotion, a spiral of prayer that brought monks closer to eternity by marking the temporal world. This mentality bred discipline, stability, and a strange kind of peace. In a chaotic world of famine, war, and plague, the monastery offered the most stable clock in the land. So as we conclude this section, ask yourself, in a world without minutes, alarms, or schedules, what does it mean to be truly aware of time? And is there something we've lost in replacing wax, shadow, and stillness with constant beeping and blinking? We've already seen how time in medieval monasteries was measured in candle wax and dripping water. The rhythms were spiritual, seasonal, and based on repetition, not precision. But as centuries passed, monastic communities, perhaps without meaning to, laid the foundation for one of history's most important technological revolutions, the invention of the mechanical clock. In this section, we explore how monastic life evolved from wax-marked candles and clepsydras to the chime of bells and the turning of gears. We'll trace how monks, with their unique devotion to the regular division of time, became accidental engineers paving the way for hourly labor, time-based commerce, and the modern world's obsession with punctuality. From spiritual discipline to public timekeeping, this is the story of how a life built around prayer gave rise to clocks, bells, and the hourly structure that defines our lives today. The bell is a voice of time. Before clocks, there were bells, and in monastic life, bells were everything. Bells signaled each of the canonical hours, waking monks in the middle of the night and calling them from work or study to prayer. The bell was not merely a tool, it was a symbol of divine order, a reminder that time was a gift to be sanctified, not squandered. As monasteries grew in wealth and size, so too did their bells. Large, cast bronze bells began to appear in monastic towers by the 8th and 9th centuries, especially in Frankish and Benedictine communities. These were rung manually, often by ropes pulled in rhythm by novices or assigned brothers. By the 11th century, many monasteries had full bell towers, with multiple bells tuned to specific tones. Bells would toll differently for matins, lauds, or vespers. Each had its own acoustic signature. But bells had a limitation. Someone still had to know when to ring them. The the mechanical clock emerges. Around the 13th century, something remarkable happened. Monastic communities, especially in northern Italy, France, and England, began to experiment with mechanical timekeeping. The earliest clocks weren't accurate by modern standards. They didn't have hands or dials. They simply struck bells at regular intervals. But that was enough. The first recorded mechanical clock appears around 1283 at Dunstable Priory in England. Others followed quickly. Salisbury Cathedral, c. 1386. Milan Cathedral, 1381. Westminster, late 13th century. These early clocks used weights, gear mechanisms, and verge escapements, a system of levers that controlled the release of energy in timed intervals. They were usually massive, requiring entire towers, yet their sole purpose was humble: ring the bell on time. The bell ringer was gradually replaced by a machine, a wind-up mechanism that could strike iron hammers against bronze bells at fixed intervals, day or night. And once the bell could ring itself, monastic time became independent of human error. Why monasteries led the way. It's no accident that mechanical clocks emerged in monastic contexts. Monks had a need for regular, exact timing of prayers, access to wealth and skilled labor for building complex devices, libraries with classical texts on engineering and astronomy, a culture of silent observation, patience, and repetition. In a way, monks were the perfect early adopters of a clockwork system. Their lives were already ordered in hourly segments. The clock simply ensured that the order was more consistent and enduring. Moreover, the theology supported it. To the medieval monk, God was perfect order. And what better symbol of divine order than a machine that ticked in rhythm with the heavens? Clocks move into town. As cities began to grow in the 14th and 15th centuries, clocks left the monastery walls and entered public life. Many of the first town clocks were built by monks or in collaboration with them. The town of Rouen, France, Padua, Italy, and Strasbourg, Germany, all had early public clocks often installed in church towers or cathedral spires. At first, these clocks struck the canonical hours familiar to monastic life, but over time, they were adapted for civil use. Trade hours, market opening and closing. Work regulation, beginning and end of labor. Curfew enforcement, bells marking sunset or nightfall. Thus, the spiritual clock became a civic clock. What was once a call to prayer became a call to labor, rest, commerce, or assembly. A new relationship with time. Mechanical clocks didn't just measure time, they changed it. Before clocks, time was flexible. The third hour meant something different in summer than in winter. The position of the sun, the length of a candle, it was all relative. But now hours became fixed, equal, and indifferent to the sun. Each hour ticked at the same pace, regardless of season or circumstance. This had profound effects. Labor could be measured and scheduled. Time became monetized in hours' work, an hour's wage. Life became scheduled meals, prayers, meetings, all on the clock. In short, the clock transformed time from a sacred rhythm into a secular measurement. And monks, unwittingly, helped bring this about. From prayer to precision. By the 15th century, some monastic communities resisted this new rigidity. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized balance, not mechanical precision. Some abbots worried that too much focus on clock time might replace spiritual mindfulness with cold routine. And yet the clock remained. Even today, many monasteries still ring bells for the canonical hours, even if digital clocks now guide the timing. The bell is no longer struck by hand, and yet it remains a reminder of divine order in a noisy, busy world. So here we are, centuries later, living in a world ruled by minutes and seconds, yet few remember the monks who, in their quiet devotion, made such structure possible. Which begs the question, was the mechanical clock a tool of discipline, or the beginning of a world too bound by time? Did the bell once call us to peace, and now call us to production? We've followed the monastic journey from flickering candle clocks to bell towers echoing across city skylines. In the quiet halls of abbeys, monks did more than pray, they established a relationship with time that eventually escaped their cloisters and reshaped the world. In this final section, we'll examine how the structured, repetitive rhythms of monastic life gave rise to the modern concept of scheduling. We'll see how monks influenced military organization, academic timetables, and eventually, industrial work hours. We'll also reflect on how the spiritual purpose behind keeping time quietly faded, replaced by regulation, efficiency, and production. The clock is no longer sacred, but it once was. Life in the cloister, the original schedule. Monastic life was punctual by design. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized a life of balance between prayer, ora, work, labora, study, and rest. The day was not ruled by spontaneity but by stability, a principle so essential it became a monastic vow, stabilitas loci. Each hour had a designated purpose. Tasks were assigned based on time, not mood or urgency. Fields were tilled after prime. Meals came after sext. Compline marked the day's end. This hourly structure, observed every day without fail, shaped the monk's internal sense of time. Life was a rhythm, not a race. It was measured, repetitive, and sacred. And yet, this stability had a broader consequence. It trained communities to think in blocks of time, a concept that would ripple into secular life. Monastic influence on the military. One of the first areas where monastic scheduling found a new home was in the medieval military. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, kings and nobles began to centralize their armies, but keeping thousands of men fed, trained, and ready for battle required structure. And many early military administrators had monastic training or drew directly from clerical ranks. Military orders like the Knights Templar, Teutonic Knights, and Knights Hospitaller explicitly modeled their lives on monastic rules. They divided their days into prayer, training, guard duty, rest. Even campaigns were planned around canonical hours. Orders were given at prime, meals at sext, vespers before evening rest. This discipline through repetition, learned in abbeys, became a cornerstone of professional military life. Over time, it evolved into formal daily routines, drills, and watches the military schedule. The university clock. Universities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, often in direct affiliation with monasteries or cathedral schools. Monks were among the first teachers, and naturally, they brought their time structure with them. In early universities like Paris, Bologna, Oxford, the academic day was structured much like the monastic one. Lectures began after prime, disputations after terce, meals after sext, independent study in the afternoon, evening prayer or debate after vespers. This wasn't just convenience, it was cultural inheritance. The university day mirrored the monastic schedule, both in timing and in ritualistic structure. Even today, academic terms are called Michaelmas, Hilary, or Lent, echoing the monastic calendar. Eventually, class times shifted from vague canonical references to fixed hourly slots, but the principle of dividing the day into scheduled intellectual blocks came from the monks. Industrial time, the clock as a master. When the Industrial Revolution arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, time left the monastery altogether and entered the factory. Now bells signaled not prayers but shift changes. The rhythm of work became mechanized, measured, and often merciless. Instead of ringing 7 times a day for devotion, bells rang to demand labor. Factories operated on strict hourly divisions. Breaks were timed. Output was tracked. Time became not a gift to God but a unit of productivity. Ironically, the monks who once kept time to sanctify life had helped birth a system that often exploited it. And yet the structure remained familiar. Wake at a set time. Work during allotted hours. Eat by schedule. Sleep on routine. In many ways, the industrial workday was a secularized version of monastic life without the silence, the prayer, or the peace. The internalization of time. Today we wear time on our wrists. We carry it in our phones. We live by appointments, alarms, calendars, and deadlines. We speak in hours, bill in minutes, and sometimes even count seconds. This isn't natural. It's cultural conditioning descended from centuries of monastic practice. Time has become internalized. We no longer need a bell tower. We feel late before we're told. We know when we've wasted time, even if no one sees it. But what would a 10th century monk think of this world, so obsessed with minutes and seconds? Would he recognize his schedule in our meetings, emails, and lunch breaks? Or would he see only the shell of structure, divorced from its sacred meaning? The bell still rings. Despite centuries of secularization, the bell still rings. In monasteries across Europe, bells continue to toll the hours not for work quotas or commercial alerts, but for prayer. They remain a call to presence, stillness, and spiritual rhythm. Some monasteries have embraced digital clocks to regulate their bells. Others continue to rely on the ancient schedules. Either way, the structure remains intact. Outside the cloister, echoes of this structure endure in schools, armies, office buildings, hospitals. Everywhere time is divided, we see the legacy of monks who cared enough about God to count the hours carefully. So we ask one final question. In seeking to control time, have we forgotten why we marked it in the first place? And what might we recover if, just for a moment, we allowed the bell to ring not as a command, but as a reminder? Story 5. The Venetian Archive, bureaucracy that ruled the Mediterranean. In the medieval and early modern world, power often wore the trappings of armor, gold, or lineage. But in Venice, a city that floated more on its records than its canals, true power was filed away. It wasn't shouted from battlements. It was whispered behind doors, copied by scribes, and carefully indexed. The Republic of Venice, from its rise in the 8th century to its fall in 1797, was one of the most stable and enduring political entities in European history. It commanded trade routes, forged alliances, and conducted intelligence operations long before such terms had formal definitions. And behind this remarkable feat was something often ignored in history books, a vast and meticulous bureaucratic archive. In this first section, we'll explore how Venice built its empire on paper, parchment, and protocol, how secretaries, scribes, and state chancellors documented every decision, monitored every trade ship, and even regulated gossip. Through layers of routine paperwork, Venice kept the Mediterranean under quiet control. A government of committees and clerks. Unlike monarchies ruled by kings or empires led by military strongmen, Venice was a republic, an aristocratic one, to be sure, but a state governed not by individuals, but by institutional memory. The Great Council, made up of patrician families, created laws. The Senate debated policy. The Council of Ten, a secretive committee, handled internal security and intelligence. But none of these bodies functioned without their scribes, chancellors, and archivists. Every meeting, debate, vote, and decree was written down, preserved, and cross-referenced. The Venetian government depended on paperwork as a system of checks, ensuring that no single faction could dominate. This wasn't a government of speeches, it was a government of minutes. And so, an elite class of civil servants emerged, literate, discreet, and devoted not to war or religion, but to the administration of stability. The secretaries of state. Central to the bureaucracy were the secretaries, professional administrators drawn not from the noble class, but from educated families of lower rank. These men were responsible for drafting legislation, maintaining official correspondence, recording debates and votes, managing diplomatic archives, filing commercial data. They were trained in paleography, foreign languages, cryptography, and record-keeping. Many began their careers as teenage assistants, climbing through a strictly regulated system. Unlike politicians, secretaries did not seek attention. They were required to be anonymous, loyal, and apolitical. And yet, through their pens, they influenced every law, treaty, and dispatch Venice produced. Their motto, rarely spoken aloud, was simple: silence is safety. The Archivio di Stato, the paper fortress. By the 13th century, the volume of documents had grown so immense that Venice built a dedicated state archive, one of the first in Europe. Housed originally near the Doge's palace, and later in specially constructed buildings, the Archivio di Stato di Venezia became the heart of the Republic's memory. It contained council records, commercial contracts, diplomatic letters, tax registers, notarial documents, shipping manifests, coded intelligence reports. Documents were arranged by type, date, and subject. Clerks maintained detailed indices. Some scrolls were stored vertically in pigeonhole-style cabinets, others tied in bundles with colored string to indicate their classification. Even the doors were labeled with wax seals to prevent unauthorized access. This system allowed officials to retrieve a treaty from 150 years ago, or verify the birth record of a minor nobleman with surprising speed. The archive wasn't just a library, it was an instrument of governance. Diplomatic intelligence and state secrets. One of Venice's greatest strengths was its diplomatic corps. The Venetian ambassadors, or bailli, stationed in courts across Europe and the Middle East, were not there simply to represent. They were observers, collectors, and reporters. Every few weeks, they sent detailed dispatches back to Venice. Movements of foreign fleets, political gossip from royal courts, military preparations, changes in customs policies, religious tensions. These reports were filed in the archives, indexed, and sometimes analyzed by the Council of Ten, who used them to preempt wars, manipulate trade, or exert quiet influence. In this way, Venice developed a primitive intelligence agency centuries before such things had a name. They also employed codebreakers and cipher clerks, who used substitution codes and steganographic tricks to protect communication. Some secretaries were trained to read mirror script or decrypt polyalphabetic ciphers. Few cities in Europe had such an organized system of peacetime espionage, all managed through a clerical apparatus built for efficiency, not glory. Commercial records and economic memory. Venice's economic strength rested on its fleets and its trade routes, but equally on its contracts, permits, and ledgers. The merchant marine was governed by a bureaucracy that required every cargo to be registered, every ship's departure logged, and every returning vessel inspected. At the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, a commercial headquarters for German traders, scribes maintained customs records with obsessive detail. Ship manifests listing every bale of cloth, jar of oil, or box of spices. Tax records indicating duties paid. Complaints lodged about delayed deliveries or damaged goods. These documents served not only for taxation, but as legal evidence in disputes both local and international. And in case of shipwrecks, pirates, or delays, Venice had a system for investigating and resolving commercial conflicts, again relying on the paper trail. Trade flourished not because of naval power alone, but because of trust in Venetian records. So here we pause and ask, could an entire republic truly be held together by scribes, scrolls, and silence. And what does it mean for a state to live not in the sword, but in the file? We've seen how Venice built its dominion through documents, contracts, correspondences, and carefully guarded files. But beneath the polished structure of councils and scribes lay a darker, more secretive layer of governance. It was called the Council of Ten, and it turned bureaucracy into a tool of surveillance, discipline, and silent enforcement. In this second section, we open the doors of Venice's most feared institution not with torches and axes, but with ledgers and sealed envelopes. We'll examine how the Council of Ten used paperwork to monitor the city, manage political dissent, and control power through a system of anonymous denunciations, secret votes, and locked cabinets. Venetian bureaucracy was not just about maintaining trade, it was about maintaining control. The birth of the Council of Ten. The Council of Ten, Consiglio dei Dieci, was created in 1310 after a failed coup attempt by patrician Bagiamont Tiepolo. In response to this crisis, Venice established the Ten as a temporary security council. But like many temporary institutions, it soon became permanent and immensely powerful. Composed of 10 patrician members, plus the Doge and his 6 ducal councillors, the Council of Ten had authority over state security, treason investigations, espionage and counterintelligence, surveillance of the nobility and bureaucracy. But unlike the Senate or Great Council, the Ten operated in strict secrecy. Their chambers were closed. Their minutes were confidential. Their decisions were recorded but not always explained. They were judges without appeal, administrators without oversight, and scribes of silence. Anonymous denunciations and the mouths of lions. One of the most infamous bureaucratic tools of the Council of Ten was the denunciation system. Throughout Venice, small stone letterboxes known as Bocche di Leone, or mouths of lions, were carved into walls near government offices. Each had a slot where citizens could drop anonymous accusations. Below the lion's mouth were inscriptions like, "For secrets regarding tax evasion," "For denouncing public corruption," "For matters of heresy and sedition." These notes were collected, filed, and reviewed by secretaries of the Ten. Not all were acted upon, but many were. If a denunciation was deemed credible, an investigation began. The suspect was observed, often without their knowledge. Witnesses were quietly interviewed. Financial records, correspondence, and previous infractions were reviewed. If needed, an arrest followed, sometimes in the dead of night, without public explanation. The accused might not know who had turned them in, or why. Even if innocent, the process alone was a warning. Venice watches. Secret archives and surveillance records. The Council of Ten maintained its own closed archive, separate from the public records of the Chancery. These files contained intelligence from foreign embassies, profiles of suspected traitors or subversives, correspondence with spies and informants, interrogation transcripts, orders for surveillance or detainment, execution warrants. These documents were often written in cipher or abbreviated code, accessible only to senior secretaries. Even other government bodies had no access. The archive was guarded day and night. Some sections were so sensitive that even scribes were forbidden to copy them. This secrecy ensured that intelligence decisions were insulated from political factions, but also meant they were unaccountable. The fear of being documented in those files hung over Venice's ruling class. A slip of the tongue, a disputed inheritance, a reckless letter, any of these could end up in a dossier. The protocol of punishment. The Council of Ten favored paperwork over spectacle. Its punishments were often swift, secret, and bureaucratically precise. For minor offenses, nobles might be fined, exiled for fixed terms, often to Dalmatia or Crete, banned from government service. More serious charges, treason, espionage, or plotting against the state, brought death. Executions were recorded in detail. Who carried them out? What evidence supported the decision? Who voted for or against, often by secret ballot? Whether the body was returned to the family or disposed of in secret. But the records themselves were sometimes the punishment. A noble exiled for corruption might find his name carefully removed from official lists, his portraits taken down, his reputation erased through administrative omission. The state had no need to shout, it simply stopped writing about you. Bureaucracy as a tool of memory and forgetting. The genius of Venetian bureaucracy was its dual purpose, to remember everything, and yet to control what was remembered. Historians today marvel at the completeness of Venice's records. Centuries of ship manifests, tax rolls, diplomatic letters, and council minutes survive in the Archivio di Stato, spanning over 80 kilometers of shelving. But the gaps are just as telling. Certain episodes, especially scandals, factional feuds, or intelligence operations, were deliberately redacted, left incomplete, or filed under unrelated headings. The scribes knew that what was written could be read, and what was read could shape reputation, policy, or revenge. So Venice wielded its archive not just as a repository of memory, but as a tool of forgetting. And so we must wonder, what kind of state relies not on armies or parliaments, but on the quiet precision of secret files, anonymous tips, and sealed votes? Can a republic truly be stable if its deepest power lies not in open debate but in silence? For centuries, Venice sustained itself not through brute strength or territorial ambition, but through the bureaucratic rituals of its archivists, secretaries, and councils. Its government was a kind of machine well-oiled by documentation, disciplined by silence. But in the end, not even the most meticulous archive can resist the tides of revolution and empire. In this final section, we explore the slow unraveling of the Venetian Republic's paper dominion. From the invasion of Napoleon to the dispersal of its secrets, to the influence that this vast bureaucratic legacy had on the modern state. As we close the book on this story, we ask what happens when an empire's most powerful weapon is its memory, and that memory is shattered. The collapse of the most serene republic. By the late 18th century, Venice's fortunes had waned. Trade routes shifted west toward the Atlantic. The city, once a hub of commerce and diplomacy, became more ceremonial than sovereign. In 1797, as Napoleon swept across northern Italy, the Republic of Venice faced a humiliating decision. Faced with an inevitable invasion and lacking allies or military strength, the government voted to dissolve itself, an act formalized without a shot fired. Napoleon entered Venice not with cannon, but with clerks and couriers. His forces confiscated the archives, seizing centuries of diplomatic correspondence, secret intelligence, and state records. Crates of documents were shipped to Paris, dispersed among French institutions, or simply destroyed. In one stroke, the memory of Venice was fractured, its carefully managed history turned into spoil and footnote. The looting of memory. The Napoleonic seizure of the Venetian archives was not random, it was strategic. Among the files were treaties with Muslim rulers in the Levant, merchant records detailing centuries of Mediterranean trade, espionage reports from Constantinople, Madrid, and Vienna, lists of informants and coded correspondences, blueprints of naval defenses and shipyards. French administrators hoped to mine these documents for insight into trade routes, political vulnerabilities, and rival intelligence systems. But not all papers made it to Paris. Some were lost in transit. Others were burned, either out of haste or to prevent enemy hands from accessing them. Still others were cut up and used to wrap goods. their significance unrecognized by soldiers more interested in valuables than parchment. For the Venetians, this was not just an occupation, it was an erasure of identity. The Archivio di Stato rises again. After Napoleon's fall, efforts were made to restore what remained of the Venetian archives. In the 19th century, under Austrian and later Italian rule, scholars began the painstaking task of cataloging, translating, and reorganizing the surviving records. Many documents were returned from France, though some remained scattered in European libraries. The Archivio di Stato di Venezia was reconstituted in the former Franciscan monastery of the Frari, where it still resides today. Its holdings span nearly 1,000 years of governance, over 80 kilometers of shelving, more than 15 million documents. For historians, it is a treasure trove offering glimpses into the daily life of sailors, merchants, diplomats, criminals, and ordinary citizens. But it's also a reminder: what was once used to control a republic is now used to understand it. The bureaucratic blueprint. Venice's legacy doesn't live on in its navy, or even its art, it lives on in how we govern. Modern governments from Italy to India owe a debt to Venice's civil service traditions. Consider personnel records, classified files, and secure archives. The idea of a professional diplomatic corps with detailed reporting standards. Systems of coded communication between governments. Use of anonymous reporting mechanisms for corruption or misconduct. Meticulous record-keeping as a foundation for taxation, trade, and law. In some ways, even international organizations like the EU or UN, with their rotating councils, multilingual clerks, and layers of documentation, echo the complexity of Venetian administration. The state, as we know it, is no longer a castle, it's an office, and that office speaks Venetian. Power without glory. What makes Venice so unique in the annals of history is its lack of grand spectacle. It didn't expand with conquest. It didn't collapse in bloody revolt. It maintained its autonomy for a millennium by choosing precision over passion and paperwork over pageantry. Even its final days, peacefully dissolving itself before Napoleon, reflect its long preference for control through management, not martyrdom. In that sense, the story of Venice is not one of heroes or tyrants. It is the story of systems of filing cabinets, ink pots, sealed drawers, and the belief that the future could be protected if the present was recorded well enough. And so we end with this question. In a world increasingly saturated with data, are we still curators of memory, or have we become lost in our own archives? Can bureaucracy, so essential for order, also be the very thing that buries meaning beneath method? Story 6. Salt, Sweat, and Survival, the forgotten labor of medieval salt works. When we think of the medieval world, we often conjure up images of knights, castles, or plagues. But there's something far more mundane that held society together, something so essential to daily life that wars were fought over it, cities were built upon it, and entire calendars were shaped by its rhythms. That something was salt. In this first section, we will journey into the quiet, backbreaking world of medieval salt production. Far from royal courts and battlefields, laborers stood barefoot in briny pits, boiled seawater over smoky fires, and hauled coarse crystals across muddy roads. These forgotten figures, salters, briners, and carters, were the custodians of one of the most important industries in pre-modern Europe. And their labor, repetitive and punishing as it was, sustained the world, preserving meat, flavoring bread, and feeding armies. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was survival. Why salt mattered so much. To modern eyes, salt is ordinary. It's inexpensive, accessible, and ever-present. But in medieval Europe, it was a precious commodity, sometimes referred to as white gold. The reason was simple: salt preserved life. Before refrigeration, Salt was the only reliable way to preserve food, especially protein. Meat and fish cured in brine or dry salt could last months, critical during winters, famines, or military campaigns. Salt also enabled long-distance trade in fish and meat, provided a stable food supply for cities, was essential in cheese-making, tanning, dyeing, and soap-making, played a role in religious rituals and symbolic customs. But above all, salt meant control. Whoever held salt, its production, distribution, and taxation held a quiet kind of power. And unlike gold or silver, it had to be constantly produced, every day, by the labor of ordinary people. Where salt came from. In medieval Europe, salt came from three main sources. Sea salt evaporated from coastal salt pans, especially in sunny, arid regions like southern France, e.g. Aigues-Mortes, Italy, and Iberia. Rock salt mines, mined from underground deposits in places like Hallstatt, Austria, and Wieliczka, Poland. Brine springs and salt pans. Inland towns with salt-rich water extracted the brine and boiled it to extract salt. Each method required painstaking labor, and each had its own rhythms. The focus of this section is inland brine boiling, a system practiced in parts of England, Germany, and Central Europe, where entire towns were built around vast boiling halls and smoke-belching furnaces. The boiling houses of Limburg and Nantwich. Let's take a closer look at Limburg, a town in Lower Saxony, Germany, where salt production began in earnest by the 10th century. Here, salt was extracted not from the sea, but from underground brine wells. Workers used winches and buckets to bring up the salty water, which was then transferred to large wooden or clay pans. Inside vast boiling houses, hundreds of workers, mostly men, but also women and children, tended to fires that burned day and night, keeping the brine simmering until only crystallized salt remained. Conditions were brutal. The air was thick with smoke, steam, and soot. Skin blistered from the heat of the pans. Fires had to be maintained with endless loads of firewood, hauled from surrounding forests. The brine often splashed, causing burns and eye damage. Salt workers rarely lived long, but the work paid just enough and was often passed down through families. In Nantwich, England, the pattern was similar. Salt houses lined the River Weaver, and the community's entire economy revolved around boiling, raking, drying, and packing salt. Inns, stables, and markets grew to support the flow of wagons carrying the product to distant towns. Salt towns were noisy, smelly, smoky places, but they were indispensable. The laborers and their tools. Medieval salt production relied on simple tools, used skillfully. Long-handled wooden rakes to stir the brine. Pans made of lead or ceramic. Buckets and windlasses for drawing brine. Large wooden troughs for cooling. Canvas sacks for transport. The salters worked in shifts, often 12 to 14 hours, especially in peak seasons. And while the physical labor was immense, there was also a technical knowledge passed down among workers. When to raise or lower the fire. How to judge salt grain by sound and smell. How to prevent scorching the brine. How to detect impurities in the crystals. This was not unskilled labor, it was traditional expertise, kept alive through repetition, ritual, and apprenticeship. Regulation, taxation, and the salt lords. Because salt was so essential, it was also heavily taxed and regulated. In some regions, salt production was a monopoly of the crown. In others, it was managed by city guilds or wealthy merchant families who owned the boiling houses and employed laborers under strict terms. These salt lords controlled pricing, supply, and trade routes, and they kept meticulous records, weights, sales, deliveries, and even fines for theft or inefficiency. Some towns, like Limburg, saw violent uprisings by salt workers demanding better conditions or protesting new taxes. But usually, the system persisted quietly, day after day, as salters rose before dawn to tend their fires. And all across Europe, families salted their pork, their herring, and their fate never far from the labor of people they would never meet. So we stop here for now and ask, what was it like to live a life defined by boiling water and white crystals? To spend decades inhaling brine-soaked smoke only to leave behind nothing but salted timbers and worn tools. In the dim corners of boiling houses, laborers toiled over simmering pans, unaware that their humble product was already setting vast forces into motion. Salt did not stay where it was made. It moved by cart, river barge, and pack animal across hundreds of miles. It passed through the hands of toll keepers, merchants, customs officials, and smugglers. It crossed borders, sparked disputes, and shaped the fate of entire cities. In this section, we follow the salt trade itself, how this grainy, white mineral carved out roads, fueled urban growth, and even bankrolled early governments. From the windswept Baltic shores to the sun-bleached fields of Provence, salt was infrastructure before the word existed. The rise of the salt trade networks. By the 11th century, salt had become one of Europe's most essential long-distance trade goods. It was durable, universally needed, and relatively light in small quantities. But because production sites were limited to specific coasts, mines, or brine springs, the mineral had to travel vast distances to reach inland populations. This created intricate trade networks, including the Via Salaria, a Roman-era route still used in medieval Italy to bring Adriatic salt to the Sabine Hills and Rome. The salt roads of France, linking Atlantic marshes like Guérande and Bayonne to inland markets like Tours and Paris. The German salt routes, stretching from Limburg to Lübeck, then on to Eastern Europe via the Hanseatic League. The white gold route of Salzburg, carrying rock salt mined in the Alps down into Bavaria and beyond. English salt paths, moving Cheshire salt into the Midlands and Wales. In many places, roads were named after Salt Saltstrasse, Salzweg, Salaria a sign of how central it was to travel, trade, and identity. These weren't just trade routes, they were lifelines. How salt was moved, carts, barrels, and smugglers. Moving salt across land was a logistical challenge. It had to be kept dry or else it would dissolve. Protected from theft, especially near borders. Measured, recorded, and taxed at each checkpoint. Salt was typically packed in barrels for sea or river transport, sacks or blocks for mule trains, brine jars rare, used near coastal marshes. Merchants hired professional carters or salt carriers, sometimes entire guilds specialized in nothing but salt logistics. Journeys were long, dangerous, and slow. For example, a shipment from Limburg to Prague could take over 3 weeks, crossing through dozens of towns, toll gates, and tax stations. Every jurisdiction wanted a slice of the profit. This led to a flourishing black market in salt. Smugglers carried unlicensed salt through woods and borderlands, evading fees. Some wore hollowed-out boots filled with crystals. Others bribed toll keepers with a few handfuls to look the other way. Governments responded by establishing state salt monopolies, imposing salt taxes, e.g., France's infamous Gabelle, building official salt roads and watch towers. In time, the salt trade was as much about administration as about movement. Salt in the Hanseatic League. Nowhere was salt more central to an economic alliance than in the Hanseatic League, a network of northern European cities that dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas from the 13th to 17th centuries. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen depended heavily on salt from Limburg, which they used to preserve massive quantities of Baltic herring, a key protein source for Catholic Europe, especially during religious fasting periods. Salt herring became one of the League's foundational exports, and it needed constant supplies. To protect their supply chains, Hanseatic merchants built fortified salt warehouses, developed mutual protection treaties, fought wars to secure access to salt mines in boiling towns, pressured salt-producing towns to offer exclusive trade terms. In effect, salt was the fuel that powered the Hanseatic machine. Without it, the fisheries collapsed, the trade routes faltered, and cities lost revenue. Even in cold, distant ports, the mineral mattered more than anyone dared admit. Salt as a tool of the state. As salt grew more valuable, medieval rulers realized something crucial. You didn't need to produce salt to profit from it, you just needed to control its movement. This gave rise to some of the earliest and most widespread commodity taxes in European history. Chief among them was the French gabelle. Introduced in the 13th century, the gabelle was a mandatory tax on salt purchases. Enforced through state monopoly, citizens were required to buy fixed amounts of salt from royal salt houses, collected at salt customs houses, backed by prison sentences for evasion. The gabelle became one of the most hated taxes in France. It created black markets, ruined families, and sparked countless local rebellions. Other states followed suit. Salt became a gateway tax for expanding state power. The English crown taxed Cheshire salt. Venice taxed salt imports through the port of Chioggia. German princes levied tolls on salt rivers like the Elbe and Danube. With salt, rulers learned how to standardize taxation, enforce compliance, and fund infrastructure and war, all with little public resistance. After all, salt was just a necessity. No one questioned it until they couldn't afford it. Cities built on salt. It's easy to forget that entire cities and regions grew rich off this mineral. Salzburg, Austria, named literally for salt fortress. This city was bankrolled by nearby salt mines and became a seat of power for prince-bishops. Lemberg, Germany. Its salt profits built cathedrals, universities, and Hanseatic embassies. Guérande, France, famous for its fleur de sel, the city thrived on seasonal salt marshes. Nantwich, England. The town's identity, economy, and even street layout was built around salt houses. Venice. Though a maritime power, Venice grew rich taxing salt through its eastern trade network. Salt was a quiet foundation of its wealth. Salt did not just pass through its shaped place, gave birth to policy, and left behind invisible footprints on Europe's map. And so we end this chapter with a quiet question. How many empires were really built on armies, and how many on sacks of salt quietly crossing muddy roads? What else have we overlooked, buried beneath the roots that kept the world preserved? The salt roads are quieter now. The brine pits, long gone to weeds. The great boiling houses stand empty, their timbers bowed by time, their fires long cold. In this final section, we look at how salt, once an engine of survival and control, slowly lost its status as the foundation of empires. We trace the decline of salt's political and economic importance, examine the revolts that it helped spark, and reflect on the odd traces it left behind in our modern world. Salt did not disappear, it simply became invisible. The fall of the salt monopoly. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the central role of salt in daily life remained, but the monopoly systems built around it began to falter. Three key forces drove this change. Technological innovations. New industrial methods allowed salt to be extracted more efficiently, especially with coal-fired evaporation and improved drilling. Salt production scaled up dramatically, flooding the market and reducing its price. Improved food preservation. As transport improved, fresh food became easier to distribute. Pickling, smoking, and other preservation techniques expanded beyond salt. Later in the 19th century, refrigeration would deliver the final blow. Public revolt against salt taxes. The burdens of salt monopolies and taxes were deeply unpopular, especially in France, where the gabelle became a symbol of inequality and oppression. This combination slowly broke the state's grip on salt. Salt went from being a source of sovereignty to a commodity. The salt tax in the French Revolution. The French gabelle, arguably the most infamous salt tax in Europe, was more than a financial inconvenience. It was a daily reminder of state control over life itself. Every person over the age of 8 had to purchase a fixed quantity of salt, regardless of need. Salt had to be bought from official depots at inflated prices. Smuggling faux-sonnage was common and harshly punished. Salt was even taxed multiple times as it passed through regions. By the 18th century, entire communities lived in quiet rebellion, secretly trading salt, hiding stocks, or refusing to comply. In 1789, the gabelle was one of the most hated taxes discussed during the convening of the Estates General, the political body that would spark the French Revolution. Revolutionaries declared, "Liberty cannot exist where the salt tax persists." By 1790, the tax was abolished, though Napoleon would briefly reinstate it a decade later to fund his wars. The memory lingered. Salt had become not just a seasoning, but a symbol of tyranny. Salt and Gandhi's march. Fast forward to 1930, across continents, and we see a different salt rebellion, one that drew from the same deep well of injustice. Under British colonial rule, India's salt laws prohibited locals from collecting or producing salt, forcing them to buy it from British-controlled sources. In response, Mahatma Gandhi organized the Salt March, a 240-mile journey to the Arabian Sea. There, in defiance, he scooped up natural salt deposits, breaking the law publicly and peacefully. Tens of thousands followed. Thousands were arrested. But salt had once again become a tool of resistance. This act, though simple, struck at the heart of colonial control, just as it had struck at the monarchy in France. Gandhi understood that salt was not just about food, it was about autonomy, dignity, and the right to survive without permission. The quiet legacy of salt today. Today, salt is so cheap and common that it barely registers in our lives. Yet its legacy lingers in surprising places. Language. Salary comes from salarium, Roman soldier pay, once linked to salt. To be worth one's salt means to justify one's wages. The phrase "salt of the earth" denotes humility and value. Geography. Cities like Salzburg, Nantwich, Salinas, and Salt Lake City carry the mineral in their names. Roads named Saltstrasse, Via Salaria, and Salt Way still exist. Cuisine and health. Our bodies still depend on salt for function. Our cultures still preserve foods like cheese, ham, fish with age-old salting techniques. Borders and bureaucracy. Some of the earliest customs posts, weights and measure standards, and transport tolls were developed because of salt. Modern commodity taxes trace their roots back to salt monopolies. Even when invisible, salt continues to shape our habits, our systems, and our assumptions about value. Reflections on the salted past. It is easy to overlook the stories of salt because they are quiet, repetitive, and unglamorous. No great battles were won over brine pans. No kings carved their names into salt barrels. And yet, the survival of villages, armies, and cities depended on it. The men who boiled, raked, and hauled salt did not write books. The women who packed fish or salted pork left no portraits, but their labor preserved millions of lives, not through valor, but through routine. And as we sit at a dinner table today, shaking a little salt onto our food, perhaps we echo that long, forgotten line of workers. Anonymous, tired, and absolutely essential. So we end with this thought. When we ignore the quiet labors of the past, Do we also lose sight of the systems that keep us alive today? What invisible hands still cradle our survival unseen, uncelebrated but ever present?